session, our first speaker is Susan Parker from City, Mexico, and the title of her presentation is Health Insurance in the Aging, Evidence from the Seguro Popular Program in Mexico.
Good morning. First, let me say thank you so much to the organizers for organizing this very nice conference, and thank you for the invitation. So this is joint work with Joseph Saenz and Rebecca Wong, and we're studying the Seguro Popular health insurance program in Mexico. So our objective, I'll talk in a minute about more about Seguro Popular, what it is. It's an impact evaluation. We're going to be looking at the impact of this new health insurance program, the Seguro Popular, on the number of health indicators of the population age 50 and above. We're going to use the MHAS, the 2001 and 2012 rounds, to look at the impacts on indicators of utilization, diagnostic tests, and treatment conditional on chronic illness. So what's the background? Why was there a need for this health insurance program? And so historically, Mexico has had very segmented health institutions. And so Social Security has only been available for workers and their families in the formal sector. And this really is a minority. Only around 35 or 40% of workers in Mexico are in the formal sector, no matter how you define it. There's a huge informal sector which has historically not had insurance coverage. So this new health insurance program comes in this context. It began as a pilot in 2002, expanded in 2003, and the coverage has really increased by any standards amazingly quickly over time. So currently there are over 50 million individuals affiliated to the Seguro Popular, and so that's a little over 30% of the Mexican population. So what is it? It extends coverage. Really the only requirement is that you do not have formal sector health insurance. And in fact, there's a couple papers that look at, okay, well, does this actually promote even more workers to be in the informal sector and avoid paying Social Security taxes in the formal sector? But anyway, so this is a program that's managed and delivered at the state level. So anyone who doesn't have, again, formal health sector insurance is eligible. What does it cover? It covers a package of mainly primary and secondary level interventions. The coverage of, so the kind of list of services it includes has increased over time. And now it's fairly broad. So there is a small enrollment fee when you sign up for Seguro Popular. It only depends on the income that you report, which is unverified. So most, over 90% of people affiliated to the Seguro Popular, in fact, don't pay anything as upfront or afterward. Okay, so the only thing I want to say about the MHAS is that we're using the 2001-2012 rounds, and this is, the survey is really very nice for analyzing the impact of the Seguro Popular because the 2001 round serves as a baseline for pre-programmed health of the population, and then we use the 2012 as the after program follow-up. Okay, so what happened to health insurance coverage as a result? So this is the population with health insurance in 2012, and what you can see is both for men and women, the proportion of the population that has Seguro Popular is 31%. So before this, all these people would have been mostly in having no health insurance. So in 2001, the proportion of the population without health insurance was about 50%. So the proportion before and after the Seguro Popular with IMSS, which is the formal sector health insurance, is about the same at 35%. Now in this next graph, we can see where the health insurance has really made a difference. So this graph divides the population into 4 categories. So individuals with health insurance in both 2001 pre-program in 2012, post-program. Those that didn't have health insurance in 2001, but do have in 2012, and those without health insurance and the other switchers. And what you can see here is for the population that did not have health insurance in 2001, 2012, for the rural population, half of the rural population is in this category. So where, it's also, the Seguro Popular has also improved health coverage of those in urban areas, so increasing by about 20% of the population didn't have health insurance and now have health insurance. But the proportion increase is larger in rural areas at almost 50%. And so that's useful for the empirical results, because what that tells us is that we're going to expect to see greater impacts of the program in rural areas. Okay, previous literature. So there have been a few previous evaluations of the effect of the Seguro Popular on health indicators, but they've mostly been short-term, so a year or two post-program, and used cross-sectional data. So previous evidence, though, what it does indicate is greater use of utilization in clinics and doctor's visits, and reduction of catastrophic expenditures among affiliates. So again, our study is longitudinal and analyzes impacts somewhat longer term, a decade after the program began. So our methodology, we're going to use difference in difference before and after matching, which compares beneficiaries with non-beneficiaries. This is not an experimental design, but our methods do allow for selectivity into the program to be based on unobserved fixed variables. We're going to use self-reported information in the MHAS in 2012 on participation in Seguro Popular, but we have compared the proportions of affiliates in Seguro Popular and the MHAS compared to administrative data, and they look quite comparable. So we're confident that that's measuring participation in the Seguro Popular. Our estimates will be carried out, as I said, by rural versus urban areas, where we expect higher impacts in rural areas, and we're also going to disaggregate between rural areas which have more supply of health services versus those who have a lower supply of health services, as we think that impacts, again, might be greater in areas where you have more access to services. Okay, let me say something about attrition and mortality in the MHAS. So one nice thing also about using this data for this project is the MHAS has, as opposed to many databases, a lot of mortality. So 21.4% of the sample passes away between 2001 and 2012. So this immediately raises an important program question. Does the Seguro Popular in fact reduce mortality? So, and of course we immediately run into the issue that we do not know previous Seguro Popular received for those who passed away, because this was asked only in 2012. So here we have an alternative strategy, which later on we're going to do better than this, but our current alternative strategy is to use state-level variation in the proportion of beneficiaries in the states to identify program impact. So if you're in a state that has a higher proportion of Seguro Popular beneficiaries, you should be less likely to pass away during the campaign. Okay, so this is a table with a spectacular set of insignificant results. And so using this identification strategy, basically we do not find any impact of Seguro Popular on either mortality or on attrition, which includes both passing away and also refusal to answer the survey and moving away. Okay, so as I said, we're going to try and do better with this later, but for now, these initial results don't show program impacts on mortality or attrition from the MHAS. So if this holds up, there is kind of a silver lining, is it suggests that the estimates on health, and I'm going to present now, are not biased, and we think they would be underestimated by differential attrition by program participation. So if the program were to reduce mortality, then you would have overall a sample of the beneficiaries that they would be, tend to be less healthy compared to non-beneficiaries if there were an effect on mortality. So we have just actually come up with some more disaggregated measures of program coverage at the municipality level, so we will in the future use that to look in more detail at this potential relationship of the program with mortality and attrition. Okay, so the outcomes that we're going to study for the panel that doesn't leave the sample are the following. So utilization, doctor, dentist, and hospitalization. diagnostic tests for presence of hypertension, diabetes, gynecological exams for women, prostate exam for men, and then we have several treatments. So these are indicators that are conditional on having a chronic illness. So being in treatment for hypertension, for some diet for those who have diabetes, and taking insulin for those who have diabetes. Okay, so here are the results for rural areas. And so here so each column is a different type of matching, but in fact it turns out that the results don't matter much by the type of matching that we do, which is nice. So what are the results? The results show some impacts on utilization. So in terms of increasing the probability of seeing a doctor in the past year, so on the order of 4 to 4.5 percentage points. This is the first column shows kind of the baseline. So how much does this represent improvement? Is this a big impact or a small impact? And so prior to the program, 72% of individuals would have seen a doctor in the previous year. So this represents an impact of 6 or 7%. We also see significant and large effects on diagnostic tests. So on the probability of having a test for diabetes over the past year increases by about 10 percentage points from a baseline of 74%. The same for hypertension, well, a little lower, 7 to 8 percentage points. Also increases the probability of having a gynecological exam for women significantly. So these are fairly large results. Where we don't see anything in rural areas on the overall sample of those in rural areas is on the probability of receiving treatment conditional on having a chronic disease for any of our 3 indicators. Okay, so urban areas. So what we see is not much. We compare with rural areas. We see mostly effects on utilization, on the probability of seeing a doctor in the past year. And again, those impacts on the average are about 4 percentage points. And not much else going on. One of the estimators shows a significant increase in the probability of being hospitalized, but that's not generally true across the different matching robustness estimators. Okay, so a lot less lower impacts in urban areas, which, as we said, is what we expect. Okay. Let me now turn to the issue of how impacts might vary by availability of health services, or impacts heterogeneous. And so, there is a large variation in access, availability of health services in rural areas. So Mexico has many, many small rural communities where you don't have even a basic health clinic in the community. So you have to travel even for kind of first level services. So you would think that having a health insurance program would matter more for people who have more access to health services. So here we're going to do really a basic cut of the sample. We're going to divide the sample in rural areas into areas that have below and above median access to health services. And how do we measure health services? We're going to use per capita doctors in the community of residents. Okay, so these are the results. Comparing the population in rural areas that has less access to health services compared to those with greater access to health services. And here really, as kind of according to our expectations, the impacts are really concentrated in rural areas on the population that has more access to health services. Really, almost all of our indicators show significant increases as a result of having the Seguro Popular program utilization indicators, the probability of having a diagnostic test, and even for the first time some effects on the probability of being in treatment, the probability of taking insulin for diabetes. There's this condition on having diabetes has a significant increase in areas with a greater access to health services, whereas in areas that have less access to health services, there are a couple significant effects on testing. But overall, we have to say that the effects are much more general and overall larger for the population that has more access to health services in rural areas. So let me conclude by saying that our results suggest that the Seguro Popular health insurance program leads to sizable changes in the usage of services and diagnostic tests for the aging population in Mexico. The impacts are larger in rural areas, and particularly in rural areas with greater access to services. For future work, what we would like to do is model other health outcomes, so other health behaviors, onset of chronic diseases, and as I mentioned, we're going to use more disaggregated data on the coverage of Seguro Popular to look in more depth at potential impacts on mortality. Thank you very much.
So our next speaker is Cássio Turra from CEDEPAR in Brazil, and the title of his talk is The Effect of Change in Educational Composition on Adult Female Mortality in Brazil.
Okay, thank you so much, Flavia. I would like to start by thanking Fernando and Becca for inviting me here. Thank you so much. Thank you for the Colorado University as well. It's a great place. It's nice to be back. It's nice to see so many old friends, new friends. I haven't worked with Hispanic mortality for a few years, and I was glad to see yesterday that the research agenda has evolved in a very interesting way. But I'm going to talk about Brazil today. I have returned to Brazil in 2006 from the US, and so the results I'm going to present here, they are not as surprising as the ones for Hispanics. I don't have any paradox or anything like that. Controversial results for sure. What we're going to see is just the effort of a demographer coming back to Brazil, joining other demographers that have been there for a long time and trying to measure simple things. There are simple things, especially for America, because you have all the data, individual data especially. So it's a demographer coming back into Brazil and getting to the country when there's this huge transitions going on. Many different transitions. This is not only Brazil, but in the whole Latin American, Asian countries. But you have the demographic transition, health transition, educational transition, labor force transition with increasing labor force participation rates among women, huge changes in family composition. And in Brazil, all these transitions were late compared to developing countries. But again, they were very fast and they occur simultaneously. There are people working with these transitions and the effects of these transitions, both in terms of the composition effects and the behavioral effects. I have been working with both, but this presentation particularly, I'm going to talk only about the composition of effects of changes in education, one of the transitions on mortality transition, especially here represented by health transition. Why education transition is important to in Brazil. There's a large transition going on, and it started only in the early 90s. So it's something very recent. Until 1940s, only 25% of children were enrolled in school. So we were really late in doing compared to Argentina, compared to Uruguay, compared to other Latin American countries. But when it started, it was really quick again. So we have this complete transformation of the composition of the population in terms of education. It's a transformation that it is large as the demographic transition or the age structure transformation. I could compare that maybe to something that it would be analogous to what you have here in terms of the migrant flows. So when you talk about Hispanics coming and Asians coming and so on, and the impact of those big migrant flows to the US, what we have in Brazil in terms of education may be something similar in terms of the composition changes and all the effects that come with it. So now most of children in school, 80% of the youth are in secondary school. There's a problem in secondary, people are not completing very well, so there's a high drop rate. And tertiary is getting better as well, but there's still a lot to do in terms of the tertiary education in Brazil. So we have substantial improvement in education profile of women. This is only from 1970 to 2010. We can see that 80% of the young women, 15 to 49, were basically with less than primary completed education. And in 40 years, we have almost half of the population, between 40 and half of this young population, with at least with secondary completed. So it's a very big and large thing. Simultaneous to that, of course, life expectancy is increasing in Brazil as in any other place. This is life expectancy at age 15 for both sexes between 1950 and 2010. As we can see, the gap is narrowing between Brazil and the most developed countries. It's something that we expected to occur in absolute terms is reducing. We still, of course, are behind when we look at life expectancy at older ages, but there is a transformation going on. We're trying to catch up as fast as we can. So, how can we connect both things? We know that about education rate and mortality from the literature. There's many studies on that in Europe and the US. But in the case of Brazil, we don't know much about it. We don't have any good estimates for the educational rate in Brazil. Most of our results for mortality differentials are based on geographic difference. Most developed states versus the less developed states, sometimes neighborhoods. So these are very small area studies. Some people have tried to look at infant mortality and calculate life tables from infant mortality differentials by the education of mothers. But the fact is that we don't have individual data for adults in order to make these estimates. So this is one problem. We don't have follow-up studies, national representative follow-up studies. We don't have panel data. I have been trying to convince the Bureau of Census in Brazil to do some linkage with our household service. We have many good household service with administrative data, with death certificates and data, but we were not able to get it. So we don't have it. We have education information on the death certificates, but 40% of the data are missing. So that's an issue. You cannot even input. One thing that we have tried in the past was using census data to calculate mortality differentials using survivorship methods or variable R methods. And what we get is something really, really crazy. We get crazy results. Why? Because it seems that education is not consistently reported in the census data in Brazil. My hypothesis is that because we have this huge transformation, this transition going on, I think people are lying, and I think they are lying. They lie upwards. I mean, they try to say they have more education as the composition of the population changes improves. All right. So I have two research questions here. Given all that, what we try to do here is to examine the extent we change in the age-specific distribution of education, the profile of education of the population between 1960 and 2010 have contributed to the decline in adult mortality that we have seen before among women in Brazil. We also try to estimate if further change in the education profile of the population will have any further impact improving the mortality until 2040. So, because we have all these issues with measurement, to answer those two questions, I have to follow three steps. The first step is to try to measure mortality differentials by education. This is the big issue. And this this student of mine, she's Lizenda, she's from Spain and came to Brazil. He wrote a whole dissertation trying to measure that because of all the issues that I mentioned before. And then we perform some counterfactual analysis once we have these risk ratios in order to try to measure the impact of the compositional change. And then we also have to project the education profile of the population in order to measure the impact in the future. So these are three steps here. First step, so as I said, we don't have estimates. So what we did, there's one indirect method in demography, or probably most of you are familiar with it, which is called the orphanhood method, which uses information on the survivorship of the mother. It's a simple question in a household survey asking if the mother is alive, in order to calculate conditional probabilities of adult survival. So we use that method in a little bit different way in order to try. There's one survey in Brazil in 1996 that asked the respondents about the survivorship of the mother and the education of the mother. Mother who were alive at the date of interview and mother who were not alive. For both groups of mothers, they had to answer about the education of them. So we measure education according to 3 categories: known, 1 to 8 years, and 9 or more years of schooling. We didn't have like a large sample, so we have to group the education categories in these 3 more broad groups. I try to give a little bit of what we did. So what does the classical orphanhood method does? We have the age of the respondent. So the age of the respondent is the time of exposure for the mortality estimate. We know that the mother was alive when he was born, and we know his age, so we know the time of exposure. We also, and then what Brass and his colleagues and everybody that came after Brass with this method did was to try to establish, we have time of exposure, but we also need the age to calculate the mortality estimate. So what he did was to generate this fertility functions, right? So we could estimate what would be the age of the mother when the respondent was born. So we have the time of exposure, we have the initial age, and so we can calculate the conditional probabilities of living between these 2 ages, from birth of child until the child responds to the household survey. In this particular case, what we try to do is something more like a micro-simulation. It's the same idea, but we try to reconstruct all the individual lifetime histories for each mother. So we know if the mother was alive, each mother. So we first calculate, randomly generate the age of the mother when the respondent was born. For those mothers who died, we randomly generate the date of death for those mothers. For those who were alive, the mothers who were alive, we could simply calculate the age, their age, since it's simply the sum of her age when she had the child plus the age of the respondent when he was answering the questionnaire. So, in a way, what we did was to build this follow-up study based on retrospective information and all this randomly generated functions. We use fertility functions for Brazil. For each year, we use mortality functions for Brazil, so in order to get a better estimates. Going direct to the results, these are the relative risk rates for the 3 different groups. So what we can see is those women that have 9 or plus years of schooling have a relative risk of dying that's about half of those without schooling, a little bit less than half. We tried, because after we had all that, we built Poisson models, so we had all the time of exposure, etc. And then we tried to measure the effects of age plus cohort plus period interactions between the terms. None of these effects were statistically significant. So what seems based on our estimates is that these risk ratios were fixed at least across the period of time that we were analyzing. It may be the case that we didn't have enough statistical power to get all these changes in the risk. This is important. In my conclusion, I'm gonna mention this again. But keep in mind that I'm using fixed risk ratios over time. So with that, we have to simulate counterfactor scenarios. What we did is very simple. We took we hypothetically changed the distribution of women by education in the baseline year according to the educational profile of women at the end of the period of analysis, and calculate the effect of that on the mortality rates. For that, we use this population attributable fraction, which is simply measures the proportional change in each mortality rate that would happen in this counterfactual scenario of a different distribution of women by education. We then estimate life expectancy truncated at age 70 because we have risk ratios only for age 30 to 70. And we also calculate the probability to survive between age 30 and 70 under the baseline scenario and under the counterfactual scenario. For the years after 2010, we have to project the education profile of women. This is another paper, I'm not going to give the details here, but basically what we did was to get the whole matrix by age, cohort, and period of the distribution of women by education, use age period cohort model, disentangle each one of these components, and then extrapolate the period and the cohort effects into the future. So we got the education profile of women until the year 2004. Okay, so let's see the results. Here are again the distribution of women now between the ways that we are analyzing, 30 to 70, according to those three education groups. This is 1964, 1960, 2000, 2004. So again, we can see there is a large transformation. There's a lot of things going on here, of course. People are moving up to the tertiary education. You are not getting that. So this is one of the issues of this exercise, but I'll come back to this in my conclusions. So starting with looking into the past. These are the population attributable fractions for each age group during the whole period, the 50-year period. As we can see, about 30% for the younger age groups, and about 15 to 20% of the mortality decline could be attributed only to compositional change in education. This translates into, I believe, into a very substantial impact on the difference in life, the gains in life expectancy that happened during this time. So between 1960 and 2010, life expectancy increased. Life expectancy at age 30, truncated at age 70, increased by 5 years. About a third of the gains can be explained only by change in compositional change in education. It's a huge impact. If you think in terms of conditional survival probability, about 53% of women survived from age 30 to 70 in 96. This increased to 81%, so the difference is 28%. And out of these, seven were saved. 7 out of 100 women were saved because of the change in the composition of education of the population. Looking to the future now, as we can see now, the impact is larger at older ages. This was expected since we're using like fixed risk ratios again. And now the change in the composition of the population moving upwards into the age groups. So we projected another 0.5 years of increase in life expectancy from now until 2040 due to this compositional change. Again, this is a kind of a third of the potential of increase if you think that the maximum life expectancy that we can get between age 30 is 40. So this could increase until 40, and so it would be another 1.8 years. What we're getting is another 0.5, only because of this change in the composition of the population. Another 5 out of 100 women will be saved because of this change. So, to conclude, escape from premature death, adult death in Brazil, happened not only because there were significant changes in the mortality rates for all educational groups, but also because there was this large change in the composition of the population by education. About a third of gains in life expectancy can be attributed to that. A quarter of lives saved in the stationary population, or in the cohort, from 1960 to 2010 can be attributed to this change. There's still room for mortality gains, as I showed. We estimate another 0.5 years. Of course, as the cohorts age, these impacts can be concentrated more above age 70. There are some limitations, and these limitations are related to the work that we plan to do in the future. These are only first order effects, of course, so these are just, we're not measuring any feedback effects, any other types of effects that could, secondary effects that could come with this change in education. Something that I mentioned before, we're using only 3 categories of education. Tertiary is a very important one. We should have it separate, but we didn't have enough sample size to separate. Because when you talk in terms of the future, most of the change of the mobility will happen from the secondary to the tertiary. And certainly the risk ratios vary between secondary and tertiary. So probably the results I just have shown are conservative if you think that people are indeed improving even more their educational profile. And then finally, which I think is the most important thing, I'm looking just at just one composition effect. I talked in my first slide, I showed that Brazil is experiencing many different transitions. And all these transitions produce changes in the characteristics of the population, of the age groups, that certainly are related to mortality. So I'm looking just at education. Paloni, for example, has a paper, has been talking about this, how changes in early life conditions, how changes in infant mortality, the reduction in infant mortality, allowed larger groups of people to reach older ages with very heterogeneous backgrounds. Before, what we had were very high infant mortality rate, and of course, most of these people did not survive to this age, to adult age and old age. Now they are coming, and this may jeopardize some of the mortality gains. So there are many things going on here. It's just not education. Education works in the direction of improving mortality, but certainly there are other things going on. So one question to end up, it's that we plan to do is to really try to measure. I don't know, we still don't know how to do it because we don't have the data. It's how the mortality returns to education have been changing in Brazil. This is very important because the educational groups have been changing as well. Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Sohan. Sohan, I always mispronounce her name, right? And the title of her talk is Prediabetes and Undiagnosed Diabetes in Mexico. Sohan.
No, cara de loca. Okay, good morning. I want to thank Rebecca and Fernando to invite me to speak today, and also to the University of Colorado. It has been a nice experience. So my talk today is about prediabetes and diagnosed diabetes among Mexican older adults. The objectives of, I have to say that this is a manuscript work in progress. The objective is to examine the percent of prediabetes and undiagnosed diabetes, and also examine the factors associated with these both conditions. Why is important to study prediabetes, or what is prediabetes. It's a condition which individuals have blood glucose high or hemoglobin A1C levels higher than normal, but those levels are not enough to consider those patients or the individual as diabetes. The importance that individuals with prediabetes, they are at increased risk for developing diabetes type 2, heart disease, and stroke. How we define an individual with diabetes, with prediabetes? The American Diabetes Association has 3 criteria. One, it is having a fasting plasma glucose between 100 to 125, or having a 2-hour plasma glucose between 140 milligrams to 199, or an hemoglobin A1C between 5.7 and 6.4. That criteria was introduced by the American Diabetes Association in 2011. So I want to start with giving the numbers that we know in the United States and then the numbers in Mexico. In the United States, using the NHANES from 1999 to 2010, and the criteria used hemoglobin A1C or impaired fasting glucose, we can see that in the earliest survey, the prevalence was 30%, and it was stable in 2003 and 2006, but then we see an increase to 37, which is a high prevalence. When we see by age category, so the trend at each, we see that the prediabetes increases and the latest period, but it's only significant for the younger group. So those who are 18 to 44 and 46 to 64. How does this work? Oh, sorry.
The red dot.
Oh, the red dot, okay. If we look at prevalence by gender, we see that the prevalence is higher among women, and that is significant. If we look for race and ethnicity, it is among all the groups, but the increase or the trend increase for Mexican American was non-significant. Including or including the prevalence by BMI, this perspective as for obesity and overweight, the prevalence or the trends increases for the latest survey, and that was significant too. So what we know in Mexico. I just found 2 studies, one from the representative from the Mexican Diabetes Prevention Study, which is a representative population-based study of Mexican adults between age 30 to 65 years. The criteria, they have 2 criteria, the impaired fasting glucose or the impaired glucose tolerance. If we look at the prevalence using the impaired fasting glucose, the total prevalence was 25. Age adjusted for many women is almost 50%. If we use the criteria of intolerance glucose, it is 8%, and similar proportion for adjusted for age for men and women. If we took both of them, the both criteria is 10%. Similar proportions for gender, and that was not significant. So we can see that this is the most common criteria used, is 25% of prevalence of prediabetes, when in the United States we have 37%. Another study that is a prospective cohort of Mexican 2001-2006 that included 656 oil workers without previous diagnosis of diabetes who were between 24 and 71 years, and we see they used the criteria of impaired fasting glucose, and the prevalence was 33%. So this study goes more similar to what the numbers we have here in the United States. So what about undiagnosed diabetes? So the criteria used for undiagnosed diabetes is the criteria for diabetes. So the American Diabetes Association has the following criteria. Individual with hemoglobin A1C more or equal than 6.5, or a fasting glucose plasma more than 126, or a 2 hours tolerance glucose more or equal than 200, or if a patient has the classical symptoms of diabetes. This is a map from the International Diabetes Federation that shows the prevalence of undiagnosed diabetes for 2011 among those 20 to 79 years. We can see here that Mexico has more than 60% undiagnosed diabetes. And the United States has lower prevalence, and then we can see globally, the numbers, how they are. Using the reports from the NHANES for, again, survey from 1988, 94 until 2003, 2006, the good thing is that we see here that the undiagnosed diabetes is decreasing over time. So the latest survey, the prevalence is lower, means that we are doing a good job trying to diagnose those individuals, so the screening for diabetes. By gender, we see the same thing over the survey, decrease in prevalence of undiagnosed diabetes, and it's significant. Similar for by race and ethnicity. However, for Mexican American, we can see that decrease is not similar, but is going for Mexican Americans, and non-Hispanic Black is not similar that white. So I think we have that gap by race and ethnicity. The latest numbers from the NHANES shows that among those who are diabetics and were considered diabetics in that period, 27.8% of them, they were undiagnosed. Okay, what we know about undiagnosed diabetes in Mexico? Data from the INSANUD 2006 that included a subsample of 4,687 participants without previous diagnosis of diabetes, and using the criteria of impaired fasting glucose, the prevalence was 5.2%. Data for INSANUD 2012 is not available yet. I don't know when it's coming to be. And also that study look at the factors associated with undiagnosed diabetes, and the only significant factor was the abdominal obesity. Okay, so the data presented today comes from the MHAS 2012. I don't want to spend too much time on saying the characteristics of the study, because we already know. This subsample includes a collection of intravenous and capillary blood tests for hemoglobin, hemoglobin A1C, total cholesterol, high-density cholesterol, vitamin D, TSH, and CRP. The data of blood samples was collected by the Instituto of Public Health of Mexico. Also, blood pressure, anthropometric measures, weight, height, knee height, waist and hip circumference. Also, physical performance measures were collected, like balance, walk test, and muscle strength. And I have to say that that subsample is not a national representative sample, it's just a representative sample of 4 states, and those states include rural state, urban state, high US immigration state, and high diabetes rates state. So I cannot estimate the prevalence for the national prevalence for Mexico. Okay, sample. The total sample in 2012 was 18,465. Of these, 2,086 is the subsample for anthropometric. I had to exclude 59 missing in hemoglobin A1C and self-reported diabetes, and those who had less than 45 years. The missing for hemoglobin A1C was 23. Why we have those missing? The hemoglobin A1C cannot be tested in all the patients, because there are some conditions where we have false positive, means high levels of hemoglobin A1C or low levels, and those are patients with conditions like hemoglobinopathy, disorders in the hematological system, liver disease, coagulation disorders. Also in the pregnant women, that test is not recommended. So I think the Instituto National Public Health did a good job in standardizing the test, because they didn't report the test in those type of patients. So they were 23. So it then leaves, I decided to include those less than 50, so the 45 to be to make the comparison with United States. So I'm looking at the younger people too. So 11 years sample size of 1931. Of those, let me start here first. 1,570 said that they don't have diabetes. Of those, I look back in 2003 to be exact, they were not diabetics, and I found that 9 of them, they said that they were diabetics. So I left this final sample with 1508. And then going for the diabetes, those who said yes, they were 414. Of course, I added those 9 that I took it from here, and among those 414, 97 are all cases, so they are from 2003. The other thing that is important to show here is that only 28% of those diabetic people have a good control glycemia, and 72% no. Of those who said no diabetes, 306 have hemoglobin A1C less than 57, less than 5.7 means normal glycemia. Between 57 to less than 65, 850, so those are the pre-diabetics, and those with hemoglobin A1C more or equal than 65, 352 are the undiagnosed diabetes. So we included in the analysis socio-demographic variables, smoking, medical conditions that are related to those conditions, medical insurance, physician visits, physical activity, a question that was asked on average during the last 2 years, have you exercised or done hard physical work 3 or more times a week. We included anthropometric measures, three of them, BMI, underweight, overweight and obesity, waist circumference according to the criteria for the National Health Institute, 108 centimeters for men and more than 88 for women. And also the waist hip ratio, I used the criteria of World Health Organization that are the good points applied to the Mexican population, that is more or equal than 0.9 for 90 for men and more or equal than 0.85 for women. So the outcomes are pre-diabetes. I have to say that the test was taken by fingerprint, undiagnosed diabetes. First, I'm going to give a descriptive characteristic of the subsample. They were, on average, age was 63, 59 were female. Average education, approximately 6 years, 46% they were married, 42% had hypertension, 1.6 stroke, 3.2 heart attack. The average BMI is 28.9, means that this subsample is overweight. And the waist circumference is, for men is 100, and for women is 97, so the women have high waist circumference in this subsample. All for waist hip ratio is the same, for men 0.99, for women 0.92, 58% live in rural and urban areas, 55% in high migration state, 85% have any insurance coverage, and 82% have at least one physician visit in the previous year. Okay, what is the overall percent of pre-diabetes and undiagnosed diabetes in this subsample? So 56.4% are pre-diabetics and 23.3% are undiagnosed. So if we add this undiagnosed for those who already are diabetic, that was 23%, we are at least 19% of the cases. Okay, how is the distribution by age? The majority of the pre-diabetics and undiagnosed diabetes are more, the high percent is in the youngest group if we compare to the oldest group, so 45 to 55 and 56 to 65. However, that was not significant. In gender, both pre-diabetes and undiagnosed diabetes were more likely to be female, and the difference was significant, but in this case, the subsample already is overweight, so that I would expect to have that. For the distribution by education, it's interesting because pre-diabetes, the highest percentage among those who had non-education or zero education. And for the undiagnosed diabetes, the group with 6 years of education, basically between none and 6 years of education, those with high education are less likely. Then by physical activity, those who are pre-diabetic, they exercise more. So I assume that if they went for a screening and the physician find levels on the range for pre-diabetes, recommending them to do a physical, do exercise. So I think that is the reason I see that percent. By BMI, both pre-diabetes and undiagnosed diabetes are the subjects who are overweight and obese. In terms of waist circumference, again, high waist circumference, pre-diabetes and undiagnosed diabetes are the ones that have high waist circumference and also high waist hip ratio. Then the importance of the study BMI and waist circumference together is because BMI is not a good marker for obesity by itself because the body changes physiological that occurs with the aging process. So waist circumference is recommended to be a better measure. 3 minutes? Okay. That's too long. My point here is those who are in normal weight or overweight and they have a high waist circumference are the ones that they have high risk for pre-diabetes and undiagnosed diabetes. The descriptive characteristics by the level of hemoglobin A1C for marital status, family history of diabetes, the less than in the last 2 years. So see that only 1/4 of those subjects they were screened for diabetes. For other characteristics, they were non-significant by medical condition, physician visits, or any for smoking. And then the multivariate analysis shows that female, they have 36% high risk of having pre-diabetes. Education, it is less risk. And states with high migration, they are also less risk, 32% less risk for pre-diabetes. I have to say that I couldn't include the 3 measures of anthropometrics in the same model because the correlation between BMI and waist circumference is 0.82, and the correlation between waist circumference and waist hip ratio is 0.52. So I decided to do the model separately. And what we can see that for pre-diabetes, the best anthropometric measure that works is waist circumference and waist hip ratio, which is according to what the other Mexican studies shows previously. And for undiagnosed diabetes, low education are the ones that are at high risk. Again, physical activity and high migration state, they are less risk for undiagnosed diabetes, and any anthropometric measure for undiagnosed diabetes is a good predictor of undiagnosed. So in summary, percent of prediabetes was 56%, undiagnosed diabetes 23%. Female and abdominal obesity were the factors associated with high risk for prediabetes, high level of education and high migration state, less risk for prediabetes, physical activity and high migration state, less risk for undiagnosed diabetes, total and abdominal obesity associated with high risk for undiagnosed diabetes. So what are the implications? Observational studies have shown that between 25 to 40% of those individuals who were pre-diabetes, they developed diabetes later in the following next 3-8 years. This is important because we need to be aware that if we find the patients that they are in the pre-diabetes state, we need to recommend weight loss, increase of physical activity. Even some individuals will benefit for the therapy with metformin, and they need to be screened for cardiovascular disease, and also keeping the monitoring of hemoglobin A1C to prevent the progression to diabetes. And I want to acknowledge to the enhanced grant. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Rafael Turner from the University of Javeriana in Colombia. And the title of his presentation is Gender Difference in Cognitive Function, Education in Urban Areas of Mexico and Colombia. Thank you.
Anyone hear me? Yes? So by now, Fernando and Rebecca are tired of everyone saying thank you for inviting us. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about gender differences in cognitive function in urban areas of Mexico and in Bogota, Colombia. Why do this? Aging, as you all know, is in Latin America is occurring at a faster rate compared to other countries. And cognitive function has become one of those things that we all study, but there are a lot of questions about cognitive function. So since we're in the data analyzing and survey business, how many of you study cognitive function and cognitive decline? 25-30% of the audience. So that's what a lot of researchers are doing. However, there are a lot of questions, and when we went to the PAA meeting, was it 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there was a big panel on HRS sister studies and cognitive function, and we were a little bit concerned that there's a lot of questions of whether we're measuring cognitive function appropriately and whether the tools that we're using are the ones that we should be using. There's enough research that has shown that both economic and health factors affect the type and rate of decline in cognitive function. However, there are a few cross-national studies that have looked at this, and I decided to, I was very impressed on how many things and how useful information on cross-national studies can be, so I decided to apply some of the previous experience in cross-national comparisons and try to look at this from a different perspective. We have shown with Dr. Wong and other researchers that sociodemographic characteristics explain a large percent of the variation observed in cognitive function. Given the unique characteristics of Latin America, we thought that a cross-national comparison could give us additional information to look into this topic better. We know that, especially in Latin America, women are worse off because they have less education than men. There are studies that have shown that, Casio showed us an interesting approach to the effect of education. There are some studies that show that cognition works differently in men and women, and therefore we should be looking at differences in gender. So I'm doing a cross-national comparison using the MHAS. I'm not going to talk about the MHAS. Everyone here has heard by this point what the MHAS is and how it works. And we're using a study from Bogota. It's the Sabe Bogota study, which was done in 2012. We conducted an evaluation of 2,000 adults in rural and urban parts of Bogota, the capital of Colombia. And given that the center where I'm at has a hypertrophy on cognitive evaluation because we have 7 neuropsychologists and 4 geriatricians, then a large part for cognitive evaluation was added into this population-based study. Looking at all the tests that were given to older adults, we decided to take some of the questions that were comparable with the MHAS cognitive evaluation and try to compare them and see what was going on. So for the MHAS, we're using the cross-cultural cognitive examination. The CCC has two parts, a screening part, which is the one included in the MHAS, and a clinical evaluation part, which is not included. And in Bogota, we have the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, which is short for MOCA, which has been translated into Spanish and validated in several Latin American countries. And a modified version of the Mini-Mental State Exam, which was used in the original SABE studies, where 7 Latin American capitals were included, and they have published using the modified version of the MMSE. So we decided to take those 3 tools and see what we could do to compare Mexico and Bogota. So we're using data from the latest wave of the MHA study, the 2012, and the only wave that we have of the SABE Bogota study, which is the same year. And we have a sample size of a little bit over 5,000 older adults, age 60 plus in Mexico. And we only selected urban areas to make it more comparable to the SABE Bogota study, because Mexico has a very nice distribution of rural-urban, but we couldn't compare that. And we have 2,000 older adults, 60 plus in Bogota. So the SABE study is a cross-sectional study conducted in 2012, adults 60 plus. We followed a similar methodology to what Marta Pelaez and her collaborators did back in 2000. And we modified it to fit the Colombian population. So we have a lot of distinctive characteristics in Colombia, some of them not so good, but we have specific things that we wanted to include into our survey. And so a biographical component was added where people were given specific questions to go over experiences they've had throughout their life and specific things to look at their life course. We added a very, very comprehensive cognitive section, and we added some questions on violence. And for those of you who had the chance, Miguel Borda was able to present our poster yesterday where we present some of the data related to violence in Bogota. MHAS, I'm not going to go over MHAS. And so the methods that we use they're listed right here. I'm going to present the tables and the graphs, which are going to be a lot nicer, but just wanted to give you a method slide because that's what Dr. Wong told me when I was doing my PhD. Always include methods. So variables, independent variables, we're using age, education, marital status, number of chronic conditions, and depressive symptoms. Why depressive symptoms? Because there's enough literature to support that depression affects cognitive function, so we wanted to control for that. Dependent variables, so we, thanks to Dr. Mejia and her colleague in Colombia, Diana Matallana, who are experts in neuropsychology, were able to use total scores for the screening tools that we're using. But we are not comfortable, and we've discussed it with them, that total scores are what we should be using. So we decided to break it into the different cognitive domains and see if that would give us different and additional useful information. And we used cognitive impairment to estimate prevalences and trying to see if Mexico and Bogota look similar or not. And we're only using those cognitive domains that are comparable in both studies, okay? So this is a summary of what I'm going to show in a very busy table. Just wanted to highlight a couple of things. So I'm presenting percentages, means, and standard deviation of weighted statistics. Sample size varies because of missing values that we're not including because if we couldn't test memory, then we didn't include them. Comorbidities included are hypertension, diabetes, cancer, lung disease, and arthritis. MHAS only uses areas, we're only using areas with 100,000 or more inhabitants, which are considered urban areas in Mexico. And the CCC screening portion includes these cognitive domains. The MOCA, we could go into, but I think that's going to be a little longer, but includes some of those as well, and the MMSE as well. But this is a 30-point questionnaire. And the MMSE is a 19-point questionnaire. So we're selecting, and when I present the data, it's going to be a little bit clearer what we did. Just wanted to summarize that. So here, let's focus just on the red squares. So education, there is an important difference by gender on mean education, with men having higher education compared to women in Mexico. The same holds true for Bogotá, but the difference is not as large in Bogotá. Two or more chronic conditions. So there's a significant difference when you compare Bogotá and Mexico. The number of chronic conditions experienced in Bogotá is considerably higher for both men and women. We could discuss this in the question section. I know someone's going to ask that, but just keep this in mind. There are a couple of explanations to why this could be true. And cognition score. So when you look at the mean cognition score, and so what we did is we transformed this into a percentage to make them comparable. So men have higher mean scores compared to women in both countries. But it's interesting to note that the scores are very similar when you use the CCC and the MoCA. However, when you use the Mini-Mental, the scores are quite different. And there are a couple of explanations for that. The MMSE is no longer considered a gold standard or the best tool to use in population-based studies because of the way it is constructed. This is a modified version that other SABE cities have used, but there's a lot of interest in moving towards using tools that are more sensitive to mild cognitive impairment and variation in certain domains, and that would certainly be using a tool like the MoCA. So just keep that in mind. Those two might be more comparable if we wanted to look at cognition in both countries than using the CCC and the MMSE. Okay? And using, and I'm going to show this a little bit later, using 1.5 standard deviations from the mean score to establish cognitive impairment, and that's what experts like Dr. Mejia and Matallana have been studying for several years. So 1.5 standard deviations is an accepted cut-off point to determine cognitive impairment in population groups. We could argue, we could discuss this in more detail, but that's an accepted cut-off point for population-based studies. So we have a 10.6% cognitive impairment rate in men in Mexico, 11.9% in women in Mexico. And if we look at the MoCA, it's 10 and 15%. If we use the MMSE, it's lower, but still there's a gender difference that holds. But this is because, and we could discuss this later, we don't think that the MMSE is a very good tool to be using in population-based studies, but we could discuss that in more detail later. So this is prevalence of cognitive impairment. Again, we're using 1.5 standard deviations of the normalized distribution to determine if someone is cognitively impaired or not. So this is men and women, and we're using the 3 scales for both men and women. And so we see some important differences, however, when we compare, when we look, so there are important gender differences here, but the studies tend to look relatively similar in the sense that we think that the prevalence of cognitive impairment is something that we could potentially compare in the future, despite the limitations of the tools that we're using. And so this is the total standardized cognition score by education and gender. And so we see that the higher the education, the higher the score, which is what we expected to find. And we see almost a stepwise increase in the total score, depending on the tool that we use. And again, we're not so happy of how MMSE is working, and so probably in the future we're not going to be using MMSE, but we thought it was interesting to look at given that most people out there are using MMSE for population-based studies. And we see that the gender differences hold when we look at total scores. And here we're looking at age and education standardized total cognitive scores for MHAS. So this is men and women, and we're looking at 60, 70, and 80-year-olds, and the number of years of education, 0 to 5, 6, and more. And so we're adjusting for age, gender, education, marital status, number of medical conditions, and depressive symptoms. And we see that the difference holds not only by age, but also by years of education, both for men and women. And we see a similar story when we look at the SABE data. So why All of this, again, we wanted to make sure that we could compare both studies and that we were talking about similar things, if not, probably not exactly the same things, but similar things that could be compared. So then we moved into, okay, we know that when we look at total scores and when we look at prevalence of cognitive impairment, there is a story to be told and there is a comparison that could be made. But again, in a couple of papers that we've written and a lot of the literature out there, and talking to Dr. McCardle from University of Southern California, and Dr. Matallana and Dr. Mejia, we're saying, okay, total scores might be useful, they could be used to estimate prevalences, but they're not telling us the story of cognitive function in older adults. So what if we look at the independent cognitive domains and compare those and see what's going on? And so that's what we did next. So these are the 5 domains that we were able to get from both studies that were not as exactly the same, but there are other studies that have shown that despite the differences in how you apply the question, the cognitive domain stands. So even though there are differences that you need to account for, even though they're not as exactly the same, if you're considering the cognitive domain overall, you're allowed to make this comparison. And we can discuss that again later, but this is what we did. So when you look at NHAS, there is a large difference when we look at gender differences, but those in red are the most important to look at. So verbal recall, when you look at the difference between men and women, so for construction, which is you ask someone to copy a figure, follow some instructions and copy a figure. And when you look at numeracy, which is to subtract from a certain number down or up, depending on how the test was given, and orientation, which is not a very good measure for cognitive function, but it's there, men do better than women. However, when you look at verbal recall and verbal fluency, which are specific measures of how people deal with language and how they learn certain things, women do better than men in both studies. Okay, so there are some possible reasons for why this is happening, and we're going to look into this in future analysis that we're going to be conducting. So we know there are differences in the way the samples were gathered and interviewed, and we know that the exercises were not exactly the same. However, we're looking at bigger picture, which is domains. So we're allowed to do that, so that might not be such a big issue. And we're comparing several cities in Mexico to just one city in Colombia, so the type of sample that we're looking at could also be playing a role. But there is a difference that we saw in education that we see in both samples. There's a difference between men and women that is relatively similar. So sociodemographic differences could be playing a role there, but still there's a story to be told. So what happens when we looked at estimated coefficients of education by gender? So construction and numeracy in MHAS, there is a significant difference in the coefficient of how much education is contributing to cognitive function overall. But it's only observed in construction and numeracy, which is interesting, and we need to go a little bit deeper into why only those two are seen. When we look at SABE, there's no one cognitive domain where you can see a significant difference between men and women in the coefficients of education when you compare by gender. So that's another interesting difference between countries that we need to look into. And then we decided to do something that I thought was pretty cool, and it's look at each of the domains and try to graph them by year of education as a continuous variable and see how much difference it was observed for each of the different domains. So when you look at verbal recall, Mexican women are doing best, so those two are saved. Males and Mexicans compared to Colombians are doing better, and you can see that when we saw the difference in mean education for both countries. And again, women are doing better in verbal recall compared to men in Colombia. When we look at construction, again, Mexicans doing better in construction, but the difference between men and women is not as large or almost inexistent, except when you're looking at very low education or very high education. But the story is not the same when you look at Colombia. So male are doing better when it's related to construction than women. And there is a continuous, so the more education you have, the better you are in your construction task in Colombia. And this is numeracy. And this is interesting because Colombian men are very close to both Mexican men and women, but women are considerably lower. And again, you see the differences in very low and very high education, but mean education not so much. And this is verbal fluency, which we thought it was interesting as well, because Colombia, for the first time, is leading the way when you talk about verbal fluency compared to Yamha's folks. And this is orientation. And orientation, again, as I said before, it might not be the best cognitive domain to look at, and men and women are, or it might be, depending on what you want to analyze, but men and women in both countries are relatively, are very, very similar. So to conclude, we think that cross-national comparison are a useful way to analyze topics like cognitive function. There's still a lot to do. And even though cognitive decline rates are similar in Mexico and Colombia, the domains that affect older adults in each country are different. And there are important differences in cognitive function between men and women. However, they seem to be similar, except for maybe the domains that I showed last, between countries. We know that education plays a key role in the variation in cognitive function, and future studies need to further analyze the exact contribution of education in the variation of cognitive function. And there are a lot of nice papers and coming from the University of Austin that have looked at this, and so we need to build on that research. And cognitive domains and not screening tools may be a better way to study cognitive function in population-based studies. Acknowledge the Mexican Health and Aging study, the SABE study, and I want to thank my wife, who is the brain behind all the analysis, Dr. Carlos Cano, who is the head of geriatrics at my university, and Dr. Silvia Mejia, who's sitting here and has contributed to all the neuropsychological approach to cognition in this study.
So I'm gonna ask all the different speakers to come to the front.
Turn this off.
Steve, are you going to the airport?
I have a 9 o'clock flight. You on a
9 o'clock flight, James.
Yeah, to LA.
I got one. Because I got a
Tonight on the
cab.
9. Non-stop at 9.
Okay, so thanks for like this great session. And we have a
An emerging scholar. They start younger and younger now. They have to get an ROI by the time
So at this moment, I'm going to open the floor for questions the presenters.
Please. For the presentation. Ian has played really nicely with Seguro Popular. I mean, it's great. You have measured before. There's a lot of talk of double enrollment. People who, since there was not much verification when you enroll in Seguro Popular, a lot of people were already in some of the other health insurance programs, and then they also got insurance popular. Are you able to track that? And then, I mean, Seguro Popular is measuring, it's increasing access in many areas, right? Or at least, I think it's also like empowering people in feeling that they can access the health sector. It seems more approachable than it was before for a lot of them. Did you still see an effect, like people who already were in Social Security and all the other systems, do they get better access? Because that's also an interesting. And I mean, I know they shouldn't be in theory, but if it's increasing the access, this is why people are approaching the Seguro Popular, because it's perceived, at least at this point, to be more efficient than all of the other systems that have had a lot of trouble in the past.
Right. So, yeah, I think that, I want to say 3 things about that. So the first is that, so there are some studies that look at whether people are more likely to exit Social Security to receive Seguro Popular, so if they want package, you know, but it's not, those studies show small effects along those lines, but you know, I would, Social Security still has a better coverage, so it's true that's more expensive, but it covers, has better healthcare coverage. So, you know, what we could do that we haven't done is, you know, look, kind of divide the sample into those pre-programmed that had another form of health insurance versus those who didn't, and then expect bigger impacts for those who didn't have health insurance. So yeah, we haven't done that.
A lot of my work in my experience has been driven by the need of service. Like people know that the Seguro is there and they are told that it's going to cover their services. So they go enroll and they get access to the service. I just think it will be interesting.
Dr. Parker, this is a real concrete question about insurance in Mexico, but when you look at coverage and providers, is it ever looked at for post-hospital care, like rehabilitation or home health? And I don't know if that even exists in Mexico.
So I'm not sure if I understood the question. So what type of information?
Well,
Rehabilitation service.
So I don't really know, are there questions in the MHAS about that?
maybe somebody else can answer my question.
Well, we don't really have, we don't have home health. I mean, INS has a very, very small program. And it's, even if you could be selected for that, you know, it's, we can say, you know, you don't have home health. Rehabilitation, depending on, you know, probably you are attached to Social Security institution and also Seguro Popular, but it's depending on the state you are, it's what's successful. Sometimes people are referred from some states to Mexico City because, you know, it's a long-term rehabilitation. So we don't, it's not that MHAS doesn't have it necessarily, but, you know, more than the services aren't there.
And it's Latin America in general. So there are very few countries that have home health or even home care for rehab. And those that do, they have them in capital cities, mostly if they have it. It's not a generalized thing, it's not a big thing.
Yeah, for Rafael, I was very intrigued by the stark educational differences on, I think it was construction and verbal fluency between the Bogota and the MHAS sample. I assume that goes in part to the educational norming that's done on the MOCA. If I remember, it's a very modest norming. I don't know if it's different in this example. But it raised concerns for me in using, because it was the MOCA, correct? Yeah. Okay. It raised concerns for me in using the MOCA on immigrant samples in the US, applying the same education norm that we use for maybe US educated populations. Do you have any concerns on that? Do you have a sense that the educational adjustment is sufficient, or do we need to explore that?
So I have concerns because the construction task that was asked in MHAS and SABE are not exactly the same. So it's still a figure where you tell the person to repeat the figure, and there's construction recall where you have the construction where you just have the figure there and they copy it, and then 10 minutes on MHAS and 8 minutes on SABE later, you ask them to remember the thing and put it, and that's a different task. One is construction, the other one is construction recall. When you go specific to the MOCA, MOCA has been translated and validated in 30-some countries and languages. So I'm not concerned about using that specific tool because there are several studies, some of them done by the MOCA researchers in Montreal, but also by other researchers that show that even in very low education, those people are able to copy the figure and then remember it 8 or 10 minutes afterwards. So I'm concerned as well, and that's why I said we took the ones where the cognitive domain was comparable, but they're not exactly the same. So there could be a lot of variation being explained by a different task, but I'm pretty confident that it doesn't have to do with using the MOCA or not. I think it has to do with other things that we're not necessarily measuring at this point, and that I'm not sure that we're going to be able to measure in the near future because we don't know exactly what other things we need to measure. And so one of the big questions that came up in the PAA meeting was, why don't we simply ask education and forget about all the cognitive nonsense? And I was like, well, that's an option. And then we talked to the HRS people, and Dr. Wallace could maybe point towards that. They invested $1 gazillion to do the Adams study, and they took him to MRI and they did a neuropsychological testing. And after that, they still keep using the tics in every way. And when you talk to Ken Langa and his collaborators, they say, we're still not sure what we should be using. There's no consensus. But part of the problem is researchers that come to us and say, okay, we need to measure cognitive function, they don't tell us why do we need to look at cognitive function. And so people at the RAND Institute kept saying, because that affects how you decide on retirement, and that affects how you make decisions when you're an older adult. And that could be true, but again, doesn't education tell us that? The more educated you are, the more likely you are to take safe decisions on your retirement, so on and so forth. So I don't know. So there's a lot of questions out there, and that's why I'm saying I'm not concerned about the tools that we're using. I definitely think that in the future we will compare just MOCA and CCC because the way they're built and the way they were constructed, they seem to be more sensitive and specific for what we're looking at. And the Minimental, I'm trying to move away from because it's an excellent screening tool in the clinic. And even though everyone's using it, for population-based studies, we've seen report after report that we say, we're not comfortable with what we're getting because we're getting very high prevalences of, or very high or very low, because the MMSE is very good for Alzheimer's disease. But when you look at other types of dementia or mild cognitive impairment, it's very, very bad. So you shouldn't be using it for those, if that's what you're looking at.
About your comment of why to use to evaluate cognitive functioning, we are actually working on a project right now that it has a why on that that we think is useful. Is that we are building a model to predict to find an early onset of dementia before diagnosis on cognitive measures. And we're finding that in different measures, cognitive measures, similar to those, similar constructs, it's in some cases it's 2 years before diagnosis that we can see an onset of dementia. So we're looking at and seeing that, and then related to biomarkers to see can we detect the onset of dementia before the commonly used tools for diagnosis.
The only thing I would not argue back, but comment back on is what type of dementia are you talking about? Because if you're talking about frontotemporal dementias, then you need a different set of tools than you're talking about Alzheimer's disease. And if you're talking about mild cognitive impairment, which could be partly what you're looking at, so mild cognitive impairment onsets 3 to 5 years before Alzheimer's disease, which is the dementia that it has most highly been related to. The Mayo Clinic group has questionnaires just to identify mild cognitive impairment in the clinic, which then if you try to move that into the MHAS, I don't know if Dr. Wong would be very happy, but you can look into that. But I think that's very useful. I think that's what we need to look into. I think we still, I think we're trying to measure something, but we're not very sure why we're measuring it. And so I think we're rushing into putting a lot more tools into population-based studies to measure cognitive function, but we don't know exactly what we want to measure. That's my concern.
Exciting, very interesting. But I have a question for Soham about prediabetes and undiagnosed diabetes. The data that you use is post Seguro Popular,
Yes.
right? There's the 2012 way where Susan showed that Seguro Popular had an impact on perhaps diabetes diagnosis and
Screening
treatment.
test, yes.
And so, and the percentage is huge. And so then that's after Seguro Popular has kicked in.
Okay, that is the question. So, even if you have access, 80% has any type of insurance. But the fact that you have that access doesn't mean that you are going to get screening the same amount, 80% of 100%. When I saw the data that only 1/3 they are screened for diabetes test, I said, why? Everybody should, but the screen test goes also with risk factors. We are not going to order the screen test if you don't have risk factors in the patient. So if they don't have family history, or if they are not overweight, and those, so you need to take into account. So, but in total, only 1/3 of those who were pre-diabetes or diabetes, they had a screen test for diabetes in the previous 2 years.
Can I,
Sorry, can I piggyback on her question?
Yeah, we still
And
have 2 more
actually,
minutes.
maybe Soham and Dr. Parker can build on that. I think it's a little bit tricky to say that if you have insurance, that means that you're going to get more screened. Because if physicians don't know the guidelines for screening for diabetes or hypertension, then it doesn't matter whether you have the insurance or not, you're not going to be screened.
Especially primary care.
That's not true for Brazil.
It's not true.
That's why I think if you have different source of health insurance, public and private, you should control for that. That may explain, for example, why you have different proportions of chronic disease in Colombia versus Mexico results. No?
Part of it is that we have 93% coverage of
much higher
insurance.
chance of going to the doctor. In Brazil, you can get very crazy results if you don't control the supplementary health.
If we don't get it
You
from
got the
private,
opposite.
it's
The
the
gradient
opposite direction,
just
yeah.
flips.
So the private is better.
Perhaps we have universal health
Oh,
insurance
you
in
have
Brazil,
it.
but the quality is low. So people buy supplementary health insurance. So if you have supplementary health insurance, you have much higher chance of seeing the doctor. If you see the doctor, you know that you see.
But I still think that even if you have complete access, it doesn't mean that you are going to have complete screening tests for everything, because every patient is different from the other, and I'm not going to request a screen test for diabetes for everybody. First, it's expensive. So
There's
you
still,
need to take,
of course, there's
you
still
need to
variation
take-
within those who have, but you have to control for that as well.
Perfect. And I think
I just have a question for Casio. For Casio, the mortality statistic that you show is all cause.
Yeah, of course.
And so, can you, are you thinking of doing something by cause in the future?
Well,
Can you do it with the statistics?
Yeah, the
you
problem,
have?
the way we generate the risk ratios, it's based on the information only if the amount is a life amount. So I cannot divide that.
So it's only for women and
The,
for all.
the information on indication the death certificates are getting better in some capitals of Brazil. So that's now what I want to do is start inputting the missing. We are on like some capitals are around the 10%, 5%, so we start having the option of input. The problem again is that the numerator, denominator inconsistent with the issues. But I think the mortality differentials by SES in Latin America. In Mexico, you have all this data that U.S. have been funding and so on, and this is mainly for older people and so on. But if you look for other countries, this is true for Argentina, this is true for Brazil, this is true for Uruguay, this is true for all the countries in South America.
Colombia, Venezuela.
This is for Colombia, this is for the census data, you cannot get mortality information for census data by education or by subgroups and things like that. We don't have the death certificates with good information. So I think this is one of the challenges. We are behind, of course, the US and Mexico on that. And I think this is one of the challenges that we want to face.
David, if it's a quick question and then the chef one minute.
So I guess I just wanted to say I really like the comparison between the two countries, Colombia and Mexico. But I was amazed by the differences because I would have thought ex ante that the socioeconomic context was pretty similar between urban areas in Mexico and Colombia. And so I think, well, why are these differences? So they're reflecting, I know, different coverage, health services. So my suggestion would be to try and make the populations as comparable as possible. I don't know if there were different age groups or maybe check the income distribution of both so that you can really isolate what the differences are once you control for the socioeconomic.
Well, we are at the end of the session, so thank you everyone for participating.